Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kostya Kavutskiy here for Chess.com's YouTube channel, and today I'm going to be doing a new mini-series about the one and only Magnus Carlsen. Today we're going to start off by showing his recent win over Hikaru Nakamura, the American Super GM, and this game took place near the final rounds of the recently concluded Tata Steel tournament in Wannsee. And this was a very strong tournament which Magnus Carlsen won pretty handily. He beat a lot of really strong players and didn't lose any games, and this is one of his finest wins from that tournament, as he really just more or less outplayed and destroyed, the number one American player, Nakamura. So the opening we got was a Kalashnikov Sicilian. It's very similar in nature to the Sveshnikov because black gets this backwards pawn on d6, but generally a pretty solid position and very playable for black. And here Magnus chose the move g3, which is not one of the main lines, but this is very indicative of Carlsen, because he often doesn't fight for an opening advantage, but instead just wants to get a normal playable position and try to outplay his opponent in the middle game and even deep into the end game. So Nakamura chose to play h5 here. This is already kind of an improvisation, but this move does make sense to try and annoy white along the h-file here. So knight c3, threatening knight d5, so black is more or less obliged to play a6 and b5. Now black is threatening b4, so white plays knight d5. All these moves are of course more or less standard, with the exception being the h5 move, but I don't think that's such a huge issue yet. And here Nakamura played knight e7, which, I don't know, considering how the game proceeded, I really have to question this move, because black got into some trouble later on by not being able to develop their dark-scored bishop. Bishop g2, and now bishop g4. So Nakamura continues to play very kind of provocatively. He induces this move f3, and then he goes back with the bishop to e6. So c3, this is a standard move. White's just trying to play knight c2 and knight e3, or even knight b4 in some cases. Black played h4, justifying his idea. And now knight c2. And this is a very good move by Magnus Carlsen. A lot of players would make the mistake here of possibly playing g4, which would be quite dubious positionally, since that would just lock in their light-scored bishop for good and give black possible control over some of these dark squares around the king side. But Magnus simply ignores this h-pawn, which is of course the right decision here. The point is that if black continues with h3, blocking up the king side is not really so good for them. After bishop f1, white's going to put pressure on this b5 pawn by means of a4, and black's position is actually pretty uncomfortable here. White's king will be perfectly safe castled kingside because the position is blocked up. And also, trading these rooks along the h-file I think only helps white, since they're still going to be able to castle queenside and have a very safe position for their king, while black's king, I don't know, is more or less going to be stuck in the center here and probably suffering. Note that in all these lines, black can never play the move g6 because of knight f6 checkmate. So, this is the reason why I'm kind of skeptical about developing this knight to e7. So Magnus correctly assessed that, this h-pawn isn't really all that annoying, and simply plays knight c2. And now he's going to play knight e3 next, so Nakamura decided to take this knight on d5. But, not allowing white a chance to play knight e3 and solidify this fantastic outpost. Now, the reason I thought that this bishop might have been better on d7 was because I think black should really try and keep this light-scored bishop, considering how the game continued, and it would have been better maybe to trade knights on d5. So what I mean is that back here, if black had played bishop d7, let's say c3, h4, knight c2, here, knight takes d5, and assuming white takes back with the pawn, something like knight e7. And I think this would have been more reasonable. The knight can come to f5, the bishop can come out, and I think black's position will be a bit more solid than what happened in the game, which was kind of a mess and rather unharmonious, and was actually punished very quickly by the great Carlsen. So after knight c2, Nakamura decided to take this knight, forcing white to capture with the pawn, and played knight a5. And now Carlsen played a very simple but very strong move, f4. So he just got the advantage of having the two bishops, and when you have the two bishops, of course, you want to open up the position so that your bishops can roam free and have lots of targets, and this f4 move does exactly that. And I think black is already in some pretty serious difficulties. Knight f5 was played, g4. And this is another good move. This is just pushing the black knight back into either the e7 or the h6 squares, both of which are bad, forcing black to play this move h3. Magnus played bishop e4. And now queen h4 check, king f1. Black doesn't actually have anything despite giving this check. The knight has to go back to somewhere like e7, and then after queen e2, I think white's position is much, much better. He's going to play a4 at some point, bishop e3, rook g1, and none of black's pieces are on good squares, while white is doing pretty well here, despite his king being on f1. So because that check doesn't really lead to anything, Nakamura decided to play knight h4, sidelining his second knight, and Magnus punished this very swiftly and effectively. He simply castled, and now at some point he's threatening possibly to take on e5 and open up the f-file. So Nakamura played g6, finally trying to get his bishop into the game. Carlsen played king h1, a nice prophylactic move, getting his king out of any possible danger. Bishop g7, and now f5. Magnus keeps this bishop locked in and threatens to try and cause trouble for black on the king side. And although the game is pretty complicated here, it's actually wasn't that difficult for Magnus to finish the game off. And for a player of his level, when you give him such a big advantage, in space and development and piece activity, then it's often the case that you're just not going to survive. So Nakamura played knight g2. This is probably the decisive mistake of the game. He should have played bishop f6 here to stop white from achieving this break, but nevertheless, white's position is still much, much better. So after knight g2 and f6, the game is more or less over. The point is that if bishop takes f6, we have queen f3, and we're hitting the f7 pawn, so the bishop can't move, and black is basically busted. If rook h4, counterattacking the e4 bishop, we have bishop g5 crashing through. So bishop f8 was forced, and now Magnus simply brought all of his pieces into the game and destroyed this black king here. He played queen f3, queen c7 was played, knight b4, knight b7, knight c6. Now this king is going to be stuck in the center for the rest of the game. And as you can see, Magnus isn't really rushing. He's just putting all of his pieces on very good squares. And when the time is right, of course, he'll find the combinational blow to win the game. So knight c5, bishop f5. Of course, we don't want to give up our powerful light-scored bishop. Knight d7, bishop g5. White's just getting ready to break through here. Bishop e6 is on the agenda at some point. Rook g8 was played, queen h5. Nakamura played knight b6. Of course, at this point, there's not a whole lot to suggest here. Bishop e6 with the deadly threat of knight e7, after which white's just going to crash in on the f7 square. Nakamura tried his last chance here. Rook takes g5, but it was, of course, too late for any kind of salvation here. Queen takes g5, f takes e6, and Carlsen had already seen long before that after f takes e6, white threatens f7, and black is completely lost. So this game was a pretty good example of how dominating Magnus Carlsen can be, especially if you give him a good position from the opening, which he doesn't often get, but outplays his opponents anyways. But once he does get a good position and gets the initiative, he very, very rarely lets his opponent off the hook, regardless of who they are. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.